Welcome to your Health and Inequality class. Today we're going to be talking about medicalization. This is our outline for today. We're going to be talking about labeling theory, the diagnostic expansion, the engines of medicalization. So here we're going to be talking about the Conrad article, and then we're going to discuss briefly the chapter of Michael Law's article about the rise of erectile dysfunction. Okay, but before we start with the class, we need to do like a very quick review of some concept that you have learned in your Soc 101 class. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Michel Foucault. He was a French philosopher. He also studied psychology and psychopathology. He wrote about knowledge, mental illness, sexuality, and the penal system. He was very concerned with issues of quote-unquote truth and quote-unquote normality, and he drew heavily from Nietzsche and Marx. He is very influential in gender theory, literary criticism, and cultural studies. He died of AIDS at age 54. We're going to be talking about Foucault because he wrote a lot about social discourses, disciplinary society, and biopolitics. And this is something that has influenced a lot of the work of contemporary medical sociologists. Conrad, for example, builds upon his work. So I thought it was worth doing a quick review just to make sure that we're understanding the concepts. Okay, so he wrote about medical institutions. This is something that was an interest of his in his early years as a researcher. So he wrote about the birth of the clinic. And what he argues here is that before the Enlightenment, madness and other forms of deviance were ignored or treated as a comic tragedy, right? Like if there was somebody out in the streets, very likely a person struggling with mental illness that was not recognized as such, that person was labeled crazy and was left out in the open, just left there. There was no place where that person or the relatives could take that person to, right? After the Enlightenment, madness and other forms of deviance were confined to new institutions formed on the basis of reward and punishment for correcting morals. This helped provide order at the center of the colonial world system, and this alleviated the cost of families who could not afford care. So here, he's talking about the emergence of clinics and hospitals. Places where people could go and bring their loved ones who had a mental illness, for instance. And what Foucault observes in this transition is that the birth of the clinic means that there's a shift in power from religious to medical institutions. This provides a new form of discourse for citizens to make sense of deviance and sickness. Right now there's a power of naming. Now when somebody's sick, you can send them to the clinic. This is a sick person. It's a state of being, right? It's not as stigmatized as before because society now has an institution who serves that purpose. Foucault also argues that there are multiple discourses about truth, power, and society. And so he says, if you think about it, for instance, about a religious society, in this kind of society, God is considered to be all-powerful and provides values of action for individuals, for people, right? In a political society, you will see that it is not God but the government that dictates the laws that peoples must follow, right? But if you think about a medical society or a society that exerts medical power, this is a society where the mechanisms of power that we draw from are not, in one idea of God, a central idea of God or a central idea of the government, but they are more like coming from disciplinary institutions that exert social control over individuals. And so what do we mean by this? By this idea of, like disciplinary institutions, right? That help create disciplinary societies. So you can think, for instance, of the military or high schools or or hospitals. So any kind of institutions where you see when they emerge, uh, in addition to the novelty of being like a kind of institution that was gonna take care of a social purpose that was not being attended before, or at least it was not being attended to in a institutionalized ways, right? Like if you will have somebody sick in your family members will take care of this person. Like the idea of like, oh, we can send this person for care, for to a hospital or to a clinic was not a given, right? When these kind of institutions emerge, the same for education, the same for the prison system, the same for the military, right? People go to these places to get a particular training, but they also get a particular kind of discipline. So, for instance, if you are going to a military institution or to school or college, right? Especially in the early modern times, in early modernity, you were going to be exposed to a series of routinized activities, right? Like, imagine if you're in a military institution or in a high school in the 1800s, right? You will have to wake up every day at a certain time, have breakfast at a certain time, take care of certain tasks, right? Help your peers, and somebody will come and make sure, as supervisors, that everything is working nicely, and so on, right? So what Foucault is trying to argue here is like these disciplinary institutions exert power, but this power is not like, the super visible figure of the king or of the government or God, right? This kind of power is a sort of capillary power that ends up being embedded in us. Like it's something that we carry with us through constant exposure to this kind of routinized disciplinary measures. So he sort of like tries this comparison between pre-modernity, pre-enlightenment, where you still have this image or figure of the king, and in a society like this where you have a king, the king is the one who has the hegemony of power, is somebody who has full control over power, all mechanisms of power. This is the king will decide who lives, who dies. His exertion of power, his deployment of power is very, very visible. Like you can imagine like a king sitting on his throne on the main plaza, and then all the servants and peasants witnessing how it's like somebody who the king has decided that is an enemy is either being tortured or killed, right? Like the power is made super visible and is put on display, it's out in the open. But when you are in a disciplinary society, such deployment of power is not really made visible, it's routinized. And so figure that Foucault uses to talk about this is this image of the panopticon. The panopticon was a kind of prison that was designed by Bentham. I think, if I'm not wrong, this must be in the late 1800s. And so in this kind of prison, the idea was that it had a circular shape. And so the idea was that the one in charge for surveilling the prisoners had a tower in the center from which he could see what each prisoner was doing on their cells. And so if you were one of these inmates, of course you would always have your guard high, and you would be constantly checking. You will be very aware of what you're doing at every single hour of the day, and you will be very careful of how you show yourself to this person who is in the center and is constantly looking at you. And you don't really know when is this person actually looking at you, right? But it's right there in the center. So like at any given time, this person can just start paying close attention to what you're doing in your cell. So what Foucault argues is like this kind of power, this kind of like routinized power is something that is we have internalized it. So it's not anymore that we are doing things. I mean, yes, we're doing things because we think that another person is going to be watching us. But it's not just like when that person is actually watching us that we do things, but it's like we are constantly behaving as if somebody is watching us. And so this is the kind of disciplinary power that he's talking about. Panoptical power, if you want to call it like that. And so, like as I was saying, examples of disciplinary institutions are prisons, schools, hospitals, psychiatric institutions, the media, etc. Right? Like they organize a widespread social processes, a wide array of social processes, and they give us laws, rules, norms that we need to follow. Like they really shape us. They shape our subjectivity. They shape who we are. And in a way, all of these institutions really shape our social practices about how to be healthy. It's also important to know that these disciplinary institutions that exert power over us have multiplied incredibly since the 15th century. So you can think, for instance, of the growth, the explosion of schools, the explosion of the mass incarceration system, and the rise of psychiatric institutions and medical institutions. So building upon this work on disciplinary institutions and disciplinary power, Foucault proposes a second concept, which is the concept of biopolitics. In developing this idea, he argues that today power is encoded into our social practices through regulations, expectations, or surveillance, right, due to the work of disciplinary institutions. And that power is capillary, is not necessarily state-centered, is something that comes from multiple sources, right? That come from below and from above. It comes from state lawmakers and police, medical professionals, family, friends and partners, teachers, academics and researchers, media and entertainment outlets, and ourselves via internalization. So we have this, a wide array of sources of power that exert control over us. But when Foucault is talking about biopolitics, he is focusing on the state. So for him, biopolitics is about the organization and management of life, death, and other forms of vitality at the state level. Biopolitics requires standards, formal procedures, and unarticulated understandings of health, medicine, and the body to be integrated into state functions. This is the way in which the government surveys, monitors what's happening with the population when it comes to birth rates, mortality, etc. So as you can imagine, this concept is very important for those studying the health system, right? In Western societies in particular. And so through biopolitics and, through the government establishing standards of what is appropriate and not appropriate, you can imagine that there's also a tendency to say who is normal and who is abnormal, who is average, and who is an outlier, right? Okay, so now we should go back to our class, but I just wanted to do this quick review about Foucault and his, key concepts that have been very influential for medical sociology. And so we talk about social discourses and how these can exert power, disciplinary societies, right, and how they are a form of social control because they have all of these mechanisms that are usually routines and things that we do in our everyday life, right? They give us discipline, and that discipline is internalized. And so the notions that these institutions have about what is healthy, what is not healthy, what is normal, not normal, right? Who is average, who is an outlier, is something that we internalize within us, and we survey ourselves, basically. We are exerting control over ourselves, basically. And then finally, we have Foucault's concept of biopolitics, which is a form of control that happens at the state level, and that is not necessarily exerted over individuals, but over populations, right? And this is about the organization and management of life and death, right? The tools that the government uses in order to control life. It happens through standards, statistics, formal procedures, right? And notions of pre-established notions of what is average and what is an outlier. All of these are integrated into state functions, and this is the way, again, in which the government surveys the population in general. So there is way more to talk about Foucault, but for the purpose of this class, let's just stick with these three concepts. And please let me know if you have any questions. Okay, now let's go back to our class. So today we're going to be talking about people who have built upon the work of Foucault on biopolitics, right? What I was just explaining. And the diagnostic criteria, which is something that we were talking about last week, right? And so last we were talking about how the diagnostic criteria helps organize scientific consensus about what conditions are and how to treat them. It also helps insurance companies to codify who, whether to reimburse, and how much is covered by health plans, right? So a key figure here is Howard Becker, who developed what is called labeling theory. So Becker argued that deviance is created by social groups through the use of labels to designate the boundaries of normality, right? Becker wrote about marijuana users among jazz musicians in the 1950s and found that, in opposition to what everyone believed at the time, that was like, people used to attribute that it was because of the nature, the individual nature of a person, that somebody will end up using drugs. Becker found out that it's actually not something that is determined by one's personality, but it's something that is learned. So he says that there is not such a thing as having a predisposition in this case. Jazz musicians actually learn through the social environments to enjoy marijuana for recreational purposes. This approach was super novel because at the time people would only talk about marijuana as marijuana being used by drug abusers. And this has continued to change, right? Like if you think about today, there's a shift in understanding about marijuana in the US. It has transitioned from being considered a deviant drug that criminals use to one that is a sort of medical technology. Sociologists who are coming from a labeling theory perspective have also been super interested in studying the creation of new mental and diagnostic categories, as we were talking last week. As you know, mental illnesses are slippery concepts, and every time we decide to give a new name to a condition, we are maybe redefining what it means to be healthy and ill. The growing number of categories for mental illnesses is also a matter of concern because it can lead to massive overdiagnosis and overmedication. Okay, so now let's go back to this concept of medicalization that we were talking about in the last lecture. So medicalization is when medical knowledge and practices encompass aspects of daily life that were not previously thought of as medical phenomena. So it's when there's a condition that was previously undiagnosed and then all of a sudden it becomes a medical condition. And biomedicalization, as Peter Conrad described it to us, refers to the rise of medical knowledge and practices embedded in the use of medical surveillance and treatment interventions mediated by genetics, biotechnologies, and personalized drugs. So medicalization affects all kinds of diagnostic categories, but it affects more broadly defined mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety. It also affects disorders that impact children, such as attention deficit disorder. And you can also find good examples of health conditions that have been medicalized in the realm of sexuality, such as the case of erectile dysfunction and female sexual dysfunction. As you can imagine, mental health diagnoses are the most prominent examples of medicalization, but these are not the only kind of conditions that are medicalized. Diseases can also be heavily medicalized. And here we have the case of Jeremy Greene, who has written about the history of hypertension, for instance, as an example of medicalization, or Harry Solomon, who has written about the adjustments that India has made to diabetes thresholds. And this also shows an interesting cultural variation from what Western countries do to what countries in the global South do when it comes to medicalization. So in the Peter Conrad article about that is titled The Shifted Engines of Medicalization, he talks about the three driving forces that are behind this process of medicalization, right? And he identifies biotechnology companies, consumer markets, and managed care. In your exams, I might ask you to describe how one of these three driving forces of medicalization work on the ground to push for further medicalization. You will have to go back to the Conrad reading to identify some examples. So now I want to talk a little bit about the other article that I assigned for this lecture, Michael Low's chapter that is titled The Rise of Erectile Dysfunction. This book is about the emergence of Viagra. And I think that this is a perfect example of medicalization, right? She in this chapter, she's basically telling us how you see this transition from a health condition that was categorized as impotence to erectile dysfunction, and how the creation of this category was very much influenced by a pharmaceutical company, right, by Pfizer. So this is a perfect example of medicalization. There are many interesting elements in this story, but there are a couple of ones that I want you to remember for this class. So an aspect here that is very interesting is how there is this shift in blame, right? Who is to be blamed for impotence? And it shifts from psychological, emotional, relational, and social factors. Michael Low even writes about how there used to be a lot of blame being put or deposited on this idea of the frigid wife of those men who were suffering from impotence, right? So there is a shift from this to physical factors, to the point that these conditions ends up being redefined as a mechanical dysfunction. So here is interesting how medicine in a way rejects psychosocial factors and shows a preference for a medical science model. It is also interesting to know all the assumptions that early conceptions of impotence and erectile dysfunction made about men, like this notion that men are super masculine and they must be interested in sex all the time. Here I have a quote that says from the chapter that I thought it was useful. It says, in the Viagra era, impotence is no longer blamed on the mind or the wife, but more likely on human physiology, right? It's also interesting to note about this case that in the case of Viagra and erectile dysfunction, the drug was made before the condition was defined as such. This case also shows us that pharmaceutical companies tend to sell the illness, not the treatment, in these kind of cases, right? In the case of Viagra, they really they were not really selling Viagra, they were selling erectile dysfunction. In addition to these points, there are other things that are very interesting about this case. The branding and selling of Viagra also shows how pharmaceutical companies many times misuse statistics that come from medical studies. It shows how pharmaceutical companies have interested in profits before patients, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because they're companies. It also shows us how, in this case, new types of diagnostic categories were created. New types, I mean that it's not only that they changed the definition of erectile dysfunction, they also created a category that is called mild erectile dysfunction, which is which made the disease more broadly defined, right? And it includes new populations as potential patients. This case also shows us the power the pharmaceutical companies has, in the sense that initially insurance companies wouldn't cover for Viagra, but now it's included in many health insurance programs. And this is really interesting because if you compare it to birth control, there are many insurance companies that do not cover birth control. So here's this quote from Michael that I thought it was very provocative. So she says, many commentators have pointed out that when the most powerful members of our society or those who control our economy make demands, they are answered. Meanwhile, women's prescriptions such as birth control are still not covered by most insurance plans, right? Okay, and so that's it for now. These are the quiz questions. As I said before, these questions will help you study for the exam. They are not going to be graded. There's a tab on Sakai where you can find the quizzes and you can answer them and send me your response, and I'll get you feedback as soon as possible. Okay, that's it for today.